So good evening, everybody. On behalf of Sakshi, the Center of Studies for South and Southeast Asia of the University of Naples Orientale, the Embassy of India, who's kindly provided us with their patronage, I'd like to welcome you all today for this evening's conversation with Manu Pillai, a young author and historian who has started a new trend of giving the history of India a new point of view, which was sorely missing. So, before we start, I would like to invite Professor Stefania Cavaliere, who is the Associate Professor of Hindi Literature and Language at the University of Naples, to say a few words. Stefania?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Manu Pillai. It's a great pleasure to have you as our guest today. We are having this series of lectures during this semester, and this is our last appointment, but we are very happy to close with Manu Pillai. We had different topics with a new perspective this year that was really interesting to me on the history of the Deccan. And the appointment of today is a very good closer to this new perspective, because thanks to the books of Manu Pillai, we can have this fascinating perspective with this fluent prose, a completely different approach on the history of India. So I think it will be a very special occasion for our students to listen to you today. So I thank you on my personal behalf, on behalf of the Center of South and Southeast Asian Studies of L'Orientale University of Naples. And I would like to thank once again Vas Shenoy and the organization Sakshi for organizing this very important series of lectures, and the Embassy of India, who kindly gave us also the support and the sponsorship. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to listening to your talk today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and yes, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Manu, and welcome again. And maybe we'd start with a question and answer, and then you can just continue. And when you reach the natural conclusion, I might ask you something again.
Sure.
I mean, Deccan has been extremely, I wouldn't call it misunderstood, but very misrepresented, specifically after the union of India and after independence. For us, I mean, I'm a student of Sanskrit, so for us, Deccan is everything below the Vindhyas, the peninsula of India. So what interested you to start looking at Deccan, to start studying it? And, does it come from an academic background, or does it come from an observation?
It actually comes from a personal background, because I grew up in the Deccan. My family are Malayalis from the southwest coast in Kerala. But I grew up in Maharashtra. I grew up in Pune, which was from the 17th century onwards, with the rise of the Marathas in the Deccan. It was a very important city. It was a very important node in that pattern of historical evolution. So naturally, growing up, there were a bunch of stories you heard. There were these characters who popped up in your school textbooks, but nobody seemed to know enough about them. There was this predominance of the Maratha versus the Mughal Empire in the north, and their invasion into the Deccan, and how the Marathas resisted them. But obviously, there was resistance before that also, and there was also a history to the region before that. And I thought, for some reason, there was this tremendous obsession with the Mughals. I suppose it's a good reason, because they were the last empire in India. They were officially toppled only in 1858. The records are extensive. There's still a great deal to study about the Mughals. But in that process, I thought that, the Deccan itself and this pre-Maratha period, the Islamic sultanates of the Deccan had somehow been neglected. They'd, in a sense, been reduced to footnotes. And I thought that needed some kind of correction. I don't typically work on this period. I'm very much a colonial era, a student of the colonial era. But because I grew up here, and because I thought there was a gap, because I thought this needed to be got out for a larger number of people to understand and to discover, simply the monuments that we have. You go to a place like Bijapur, and it's a stunning city. You go to Hyderabad, and you see a lot of 18th century Nizam architecture, Nizam era architecture, from the Mughal period, the Nizams being representatives of the Mughals. But the whole city essentially stands in the shadow of Golconda Fort, which was, the Qutub Shahi dynasty and people before them, the Deccan Sultans of that age. They were involved over there. The shadow is quite literally over the city. So I thought there was a need to talk about the Deccan a little bit more. It seems to have whetted people's appetites because the reception was very good. Since then, Anirudh Kanisetti has done another book on the Deccan, but an even earlier era. He goes back to the medieval period, whereas I tackle more or less the early modern. He's essentially contributed to the earlier period. So I think there is now a growing interest in it, not just in academic circles where it was always there, but also among a larger audience. And that's only to be welcomed because, the stories are phenomenal. The historical dynamics are phenomenal. And in a sense, even the way we look at India itself can change if we put Deccan at the center, as opposed to taking North India as the center of everything.
We actually did have Anirudh come start off our conferences here, so we got you also in kind of in chronological order, so that was good. And it was very interesting because he spoke about the really initial part of his book, which was the earlier story of the Deccan. My question to you is, I have two parts of this question because, you have Hyderabad, Telangana, which becomes a center of power. You have Tamil Nadu, which is another center of power. You have the three kings of, Tamilkam, which are as ancient as history. What, according to you, would you characterize was the turning point in the histories of the Deccan?
Obviously, one would say that perhaps the invasions from the north were a major chapter opener. There was a before the invasion, there was an after the invasion. Quite simply because new power structures emerged, new dynasties emerged, a new religion made its power felt in a very different way. For example, Islam was always present in coastal enclaves across South India, but that came through trade. It came through merchants, and there was a kind of indigenization of that Islam with local cultures. Whereas this was now Islam accompanied with power, and it came from the north. And the kings of the Deccan knew that there was something stirring in the north, because you find that even in the late 13th century, long before the first Turkic armies have showed up in the Deccan, somebody like the king of the Yadavas in Devagiri has an inscription where he says that I am so valorous and great that even the Turks shake at the sound of my name. So he knew they were there. He knew they were very powerful, but nobody quite, I suppose, expected the kind of disruption they would cause. And it was, I suppose, a century of disruption because, these armies swept through South India. They took advantage of the dissensions that existed between the Yadavas of Devagiri, the Hoysalas, and the Kakatiyas in what is Telangana/Andhra Pradesh. So, the three big empires of the Deccan. And all three were toppled. You find that the sultanates emerge, or rather one big sultanate, the Bahmani Sultanate, first shows up. And then equally at the same time, there's also the so-called Hindu empire of Vijayanagara that emerges. Both the so-called Hindu empire and the so-called Islamic empire emerge at the same moment. They're born out of the same crisis, and they're born out of the same disruption. What's interesting is, however, that the Sultanate here emerges in rebellion from Delhi. So there's also a clear cutting off from the north and a kind of creation of their own identity. And that identity in many ways was also shaped by the sea. It was shaped by access to the sea. If the northern empires had a direct land route to Persia, to the rest of the Islamic world, this part of India in the Deccan and the Bahmani Sultanate that emerged here was about trade. It was about using the oceans to get access to Egypt, to get access to Persia, to get legitimacy from religious figures there and so on, and often to import talent into India. And this importing of people was another big dynamic in Deccan history. You have a huge influx of Persian, you have an influx of Africans, you've got an influx of technology men, you've got an influx of artillery, experts, you've got women coming into the harems from places as far away as Georgia, Russia, apparently. So there's a lot of change stirring in this time, and it leaves its mark on local culture. It leaves its mark on local religions, and it's more than just a clash of religions. Often people have reduced this period to a clash of religions. Perhaps in the beginning, when they were invading armies and there were people resisting them, religion was used as a kind of way of rallying people together. But once the conflict was over, once these new power structures emerged, I think they were sort of absorbed into local soil. People, came adjusted and came to new realities with this. And it resulted in a fascinating chapter in Indian history. So for me, that was something very fascinating. The medieval was not something I went into, but very much the collapse of the medieval, or the end of that, and the start of what you would eventually call the early modern. I think that period, in some ways, is a bridge between the earlier Hindu empires that were there, and then the Marathas were again a Hindu force that emerged much later in the 17th century.
I'll ask you a question which is far relevant these days in Indian politics as well, even though we'd rather dwell with the past rather than the present. But to a large extent, from what I've been studying, a lot of this sentiment of resisting the foreigners starts off around 1240 with Jnaneshwara in Maharashtra. And one of the reasons why, there's such a strong Hindutva movement around Nagpur, and I mean, I grew up in Bombay, so quite familiar with the region, happens because this was a spiritual movement. But, it was very clear there it was resisting the foreigners. And if you look at epigraphs and you look at all kinds of, things, they're more racial rather than religious. So it is the destroyer of the Turukas rather than the destroyer of this. How would you put a certain period to where this went from foreigners to Islam? Do you see evidence in that conflict, or is it something that you can attribute more to the Mughal period, post-Mughal period, the British period?
I wouldn't say, we sometimes fall between these two stools of one set of people saying that, oh, everything was syncretic and wonderful and religion didn't matter. People just got along wonderfully. It was like a paradise on earth. The other extreme is that everything was about religion. Everything was about a clash between Hindus and Muslims. Now, firstly, our modern understanding of these religious identities is not the same as what they were 800 years ago. There was no communal category called the Hindus. There was no communal category called the Muslims to begin with. So, both are a bit of a stretch, both these positions that people take. What I have found, and my argument typically tends to be, is that kingly identities, kings used religion to legitimize themselves, which is true anywhere in the world. When you come to power, whether it's the Ottomans, whether it's Christian empires in Europe, once you've come to power, you cement your power. Religion is an important force to legitimize yourself. You are the agents mediating between the real world and gods and so on and so forth. But then there's also the reality of the people on the ground. That is where things are indeed much more syncretic. That is where there is a lot in give and take between religions. The best example is and this is something I give very often, is of Shivaji, who emerges in the Deccan in the 17th century as leader of the Marathas, the first Chhatrapati, or the king of the Marathas. What's interesting is that if you look at the court poem, the Shiva Bharata, that he commissions in the 1670s, it is deeply infused with religious feeling. He's an incarnation of Vishnu, born to destroy the Muslims. He's here to restore balance and dharma to the earth. And naturally, a lot of people today read a kind of very strong Hindu identity into that. That is his kingly definition. That is how he's defining himself as a king. It didn't prevent him from employing Muslims in his army, employing qazis, using Islamic law, for example, so on and so forth. And, as is often said in every textbook in Maharashtra has it, he treated the Quran with great respect, etc. But more importantly, look at his own family tree. If you look at Shivaji's father and uncle, they were named Shahaji and Sharifji. And both those names come from the name of a Muslim Sufi saint called Shah Sharif. The story goes, and it's in Shivaji, the poem I just referred to. Shivaji talks about how his grandparents didn't have children, so they went to a holy man. He blessed them, and they had 2 sons. So they named the sons after this holy man. The holy man was Shah Sharif, therefore Shahaji and Sharifji. It was a Muslim Sufi saint, which meant that on the ground, even in Shivaji's family, it was a syncretic experience. But once he graduated into power, once he graduated into that kingly position, the stakes were different. That's where religion comes in and infuses you with a certain different meaning, and you use that to express your vision of the world. So there's certainly something going on here. Both are true, but both are not the extreme positions that people take. And you find that in earlier periods also. You find that on a lot of the sultanates of the Deccan, they relied very much on Hindu talent, because Muslim power was very much limited to the urban nodes, to the urban centers, to the places where the Sultan or the Sultan's courts were. to penetrate the hinterland. They didn't have modern technology. They didn't have up-to-date communications as we do. In order to penetrate the hinterland and gather your taxes, you needed people in the middle. You needed mediators who came from the local communities. The Maratha caste itself emerges partly in engagement with the sultans. They become this kind of aristocracy in the hinterland who are helping the sultanates gain their revenue, supporting them in military activities and so on. A lot of Brahmins, of course, there are enough who are agitated by the fact that they've got Muslim rulers, but equally there are a lot of Brahmins working for the sultanates. They're working as clerks, they're working as ambassadors, and in later periods, you find in the 1630s, Murari Pandit, he's a military general in Bijapur. In Golconda, in the Qutub Shahi kingdom, you find that before the Mughals invade, the minister and the finance minister are two brothers, two Brahmins called Akhanna and Madanna. So they were also part of that structure. They found spaces for themselves within this new ecosystem that existed. So it was a much more complicated world than some of these political debates today suggest. But that's precisely what makes it fascinating. It doesn't mean there was no conflict. It doesn't mean there was no animosity. It doesn't mean everybody sort of managed to pull together and pull along. It simply means that things are more complicated than these simplistic arguments that people put forward. I think there was a lot more happening in that time. Just as our world is a complex world, that was also a complex world, and we need to, if we're studying it, it deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than through simplistic categories that we use today and try to retrospectively apply to that period.
I do think that, after 75 years of independence, we are at a point where, diversity like India, obviously, wherever the diversity meets, there is bound to be friction. And this would have been as the case 3,000 years ago as it is today. And I think we kind of fall into this false trap of trying to justify this friction rather than, logicize it or simplify it, rather than say it is what it is and let's move on from here. Yeah. I'll ask you a question which kind of struck me reading your book, Rebel Sultans, because that's my favorite part of history. That's my favorite period of history. And I'm doing a lot of 1340s West Coast studies, so 1300s West Coast studies. You bring a lot of Persian influence to these sultanates, and rightly so, because all of them really would love to prove to the Persian crowd that they had arrived, that they were, ruling and be recognized and maybe even honored by the Persian rulers. However, you don't bring in a lot of connections with the Arab world, which I'm sure should have been there. That's something that I have studied as far as the supply of horses went, and one of the reasons why Vijayanagara became from a kingdom to an empire is because they took over Goa and horses from Zulfar started coming by the sea route. So obviously there was a connection to the Persian Gulf, and I don't see you've given it enough coverage in your book. Would you like to touch on that, please?
I think there was, in the early periods when the sultanates were established, there was more of a conscious exercise in reaching out to the Arab world, the holy sites, the sacred cities, and so on and so forth. But what happens is that with the emergence of Persia as a very important power center, and remember, Persia is also neighbors to the Mughals in due course. The Mughals and the Persians are side to side, and they're sort of rivals between, among each other. Now, that is in a sense manipulated and used by the sultans of the Deccan. Now, when they pay homage to the Persian emperor, it's very convenient for them because the Persian emperor is far away. He's across the sea. He's not going to immediately land up with an army and try and conquer them. The person who wants to do that is the Mughal emperor. And therefore, saying that, oh no, we can't really subscribe to the Mughals. And when the Mughals asked that, the Deccan Sultans should be vassals of the Mughal Empire, the Deccan Sultans say, oh no, we can't, because we're already vassals of the Shah of Iran or the Persian king. And it's very convenient because the Persian king isn't actually going to come and actually press them and put any pressure on them. All the same, the Persian king also has a certain value in the Deccan because, in a sense, having these important vassal states in India, in the Deccan, is a mark of his own prestige. It's a mark of his own reach. Practically speaking, the reach is limited because at one point when he sends an ambassador to the Qutub Shah of Golconda and asks for a daughter, his daughter's hand in marriage, the Qutub Shah refuses. They don't actually end up sending the princess to Persia. So I think the sort of political dynamic that existed between these sultanates and how they try to balance the Mughals with the Persians, to me was much more important and much more interesting than their initial efforts to gain legitimacy from religious authorities in Arabia. They even went so far, as far as Egypt to get one of the caliphs there to legitimize them in the early period. That was a very much early, 1300s kind of position. But then you see that the orientation shifts somewhat as Persia becomes the main place that they look up to. And it's also the place that's, as you said, horses are coming in from there. More importantly, a lot of manpower is coming from there. A lot of women are coming from there, and the networks are not just with the Deccan Sultans. Now, there's in the late 1500s, 1590s, the famous queen of Ahmednagar, Chand Bibi. Her mother was a woman called Khunza Humayun. Khunza Humayun came from a Persian family, and she was related to a man called Bayram Khan, who was the regent of Emperor Akbar. So the same family has supplied individuals who've gone into the Deccan Sultanates and married a Deccan Sultan, and another man's gone off and become regent to the Emperor Akbar, who's a teenager at that time. So clearly the networks sort of, they sort of go in different directions. And all of that to me was very interesting because it, again, wasn't purely about religion. In some ways it was ethnic because, the Persians also become a very powerful faction. They become a very powerful group within the Deccan, and they acquire something that the Arabs in that sense never do. In the Deccan, you never hear of an Arab kind of faction existing in the courts. The Afakis or the Westerners or the foreigners that they refer to are very much a Persianate, Iranian kind of cultural, set that have come onto the Deccan and become an important force there. And they work against the local Muslims who are there. Siding with the local Muslims are the Marathas as well as the African immigrants. But the Sultans also need the prestige that the Iranians bring in. So all of that to me was extremely fascinating. And to me, therefore, seemed that the Arab connection was in a sense demoted compared to what the Sultans expected from Persia, and how much of an influence or how much of a shadow the Persian culture especially cast on top of the Deccan Sultans. So I think that may be perhaps why subconsciously you find perhaps that the Persian element is emphasized in the book a great deal.
Well, the Hindu-Muslim story, well, it's been underlined for quite a bit. Anybody who's done history in India reads about this kind of big conflict. But then it's also not a conflict because the older textbooks talk about how everybody honored everybody else, but they eventually ended up killing everybody else. So my question is the Sunni-Shia face-off, which probably cost more lives in that period that you address than Hindu-Muslim strife. And I bring this up only because I also want to bring up Sufism and its importance, because all three, the Sunni, Shia and the Sufi and the various other Islamic sects that India hosts, which probably are far more than in the Islamic world itself, define today's politics, like the Deobandis go and define Turkish politics today. So would you like to speak a little about that? Because I know you've not covered it to not distract from your narrative, which was beautiful, but I'm sure you came across a lot of information that you could share with us.
Yes, the Sufi Sunni thing is actually very interesting, and you find that this becomes a perennial problem in the Sultanates. The faction that exists within, and again, this brings me back to the earlier answer, which is that the Persian immigrants were obviously largely Shia, whereas the local Muslims who were already there, who had come, some of them from the north, some of them who converted in the Deccan and became Muslims, they were all Sunni Muslims. So the division was not just racial, the racial division intersected a kind of sectarian difference as well. It was a kind of overlap of two different kinds of division that existed between these people. And you find in a state like Bijapur, for example, the sultans themselves keep flipping. The first Sultan, Yusuf Adil Khan, he wants to be a Shia, but then he gets attacked for it, and then he goes back to being a Sunni. His son is definitely a committed Shia. Then you have somebody in the same dynasty a few generations later, Ibrahim Adil Shah II. He's a Sunni, even though a lot of people think he's actually pro-Shia. And then, there's this funny little anecdote about how when he came to the throne, a lot of people assumed that he would convert to Shiism. And therefore, they all sort of preempted him to show that they were very loyal, and they all went and converted. And the king decided he was not going to become a Shia. And then these people had to come back and become Sunnis. But the jokes are a way of also expressing that the division was very real, and it was a very political division that existed. It results in these factions that exist. It results in power formations in the courts of the Deccan, and that becomes a kind of handicap for the Sultanates. And the handicap begins right from the time of the Bahmani Sultans. For those who are not familiar, you have the Bahmani Sultanate established in the 1340s, and it continues all the way to the late 1500s with a degree of vitality, or at least namesake, or rather mid 1500s. That's when it finally loses all its steam, and the last of the so-called Bahmani emperors disappears and goes off to Mecca. One of the reasons the Bahmani Sultanates crumbled is precisely this: the Shia-Sunni divide that existed got out of hand. You could play a kind of balancing of these two factions to a certain degree, but it could be also exploited to topple one set. You have sultans expelling an entire set of nobles just because they're Shias, perhaps, or you have a Shia nobleman like Mahmud Gawan, who's a very able minister, but his identity is ultimately held against him, and the Sunnis are not happy and they end up conspiring against him. So you've got all of this happening. Even the successor states of the Bahmanis that emerged from the 1500s onwards, originally as, let's say, people who pay tribute to the Bahmani emperor, but then the tribute becomes smaller and smaller, the emperor becomes more and more namesake, and these sultanates become autonomous in all but name, and finally the emperor himself disappears. You find that the Ahmednagar Sultanate, which are called the Nizam Shahis, they're very much Shia. Even though they're descended from a local convert, a Brahmin who converts, they're actually Shias, and so committed that, with the exception of one sultan, all their bodies were sent off after death to be buried in Karbala. In Bijapur, as I said, the sultans keep flipping. One sultan's a Shia, the other's a Sunni. They keep constantly going back and forth. Eventually, the Mughals forced them to give up the Shia faith, and they have to officially pay, homage to the Sunni side. Then you have the Qutub Shahis, who are again, naturally they themselves are immigrants from Persia. Therefore, they are also very much on the Shia side. But this handicap that resulted in the Bahmani Empire crumbling because these internal divisions got too much, ultimately start working in the successor sultanates as well. So it is certainly something to be reckoned with. The Sufis were also an important force, and they could be a very powerful political force. The best story that illustrates is there was this in the early 1400s, there was a sultan called Feroz Shah Bahmani, very talented guy, a polyglot, spoke multiple languages, apparently collected wives from different parts of the world and liked to speak to each wife in her own mother tongue to improve his own language skills. Very colorful figure, obviously. He wanted his son to succeed, but his brother was also very talented and a very important figure at court. And what ultimately tilted the balance was an important Sufi figure choosing the brother and sort of giving his turban to the brother, which indicated to larger segments that this important religious functionary was legitimizing the brother as opposed to Feroz Shah's nominated successor. And Feroz Shah had no option. Some say he was strangled to death as he was dying in his sort of bed, unwell and in his deathbed already. But his brother succeeded him, precisely because not only had he managed to get enough hard power on his side, he had also managed to get endorsement from the most important religious figure over there. And this is a challenge you find not just in the Deccan. You find Akbar, the great Mughal emperor, also facing it. Akbar had no qualms getting certain people drowned in a river, some others sent off into exile or officially on pilgrimage to Mecca, but for all practical purposes, they were sent into exile. And you have similar strategies working in the Deccan as well, where Ibrahim Adil Shah II, for example, has a particular Sufi who's really chewing his brains and not happy that Ibrahim Adil Shah is talking to Hindus. He's patronizing Marathi over Persian, which is the local language as opposed to the elite Persian language. And he also ends up telling this man, why don't you just go to Mecca? If you care for your life, just get lost while you can, or else this isn't going to end well for you. So I think that pressure from religious authorities did exist. It was something very real. And sultans therefore had to balance. I mean, it's an interesting world, right? They themselves know that they're, in a sense, ruling over a majority of people who don't come from their cultural background, or in many cases, not even their ethnic background. Yes, they marry a lot of local women. They marry some of the African women who are there. They marry Brahmin, descendants of Brahmin converts. They marry Persian women. All of that is true, but their identity culturally is still different. So they have to first maintain that authority. Secondly, there are existing power segments among the Hindus that they have to balance, which is how the Marathas emerge. Then there's the African group, then there's the Shia group, there's the Sunni group and the religious group. And you've got pressure from above in the form of the Mughals constantly trying to dominate you and ultimately to invade your kingdoms. So Sultan is always trying to balance these multiple pieces on the chessboard and make sure that it all stays intact. Some succeeded and some did not. And often what tilted the scales could be a religious figure. It could be a marriage gone wrong. It could be a faction that was disappointed and decided to go ahead with an assassination. It could be pure religious sectarianism, because, in Golconda, for example, by the end, there were a lot of powerful Muslims who felt that the Hindu Brahmin ministers, that the Sultan was not very interested in actual governance. He had outsourced government to his ministers, and they were Brahmins. So they were again patronizing the Hindu element in court, and to the neglect of the other factions. They didn't balance them out well enough. The result was that they were murdered, and that ultimately the Mughals come and take over the kingdom as well. And it offers an excuse to the Mughals. Aurangzeb can pose as a great defender of Islam, saying that, oh, the kingdom has been outsourced to infidels, and therefore I need to come and conquer it in order to restore balance to this terrible situation, and so on. Equally, we realize that there was a kind of cynical play. It was often Machiavellian. Aurangzeb, again, to give you the same example, when he comes here, one of the reasons he goes into these sultanates, into Bijapur, for example, is saying that, oh, these are Shia sultans, and Shiism is not something, it's heresy. As a good Sunni sultan, he can't deal with it. His own mother was a Shia. Fighting for him in his own army was Shia noblemen. So obviously it was just an excuse. Obviously it was just a kind of pretext to set the battle going. But, that kind of cynical play also existed. So it was, as I said earlier, it was a very complicated world where all of this exists to different degrees. Something may dominate the others at different moments. Sometimes you have a good sultan who keeps it in check. Sometimes you've got weak rulers who are unable to do that. Sometimes you've got talented ministers. Sometimes you've got talented women who help restore a balance, even if the men are useless, which was the case in the Qutub Shahi court, where it was actually Hayat Bakhsh Begum, the sultan's mother, who actually ended up negotiating with the Mughals at a critical moment and ended up putting an end to that particular war that was going on at that time. So, it's a combination of all these factors that constituted politics at that time, but that's also why it's so fascinating and interesting.
Let me pick up on what you said, because I have three other questions, but let me pick up on what you said about the influence of women. Now, my experience with Indian history is the fact that normally most of these rulers, whether Hindu or Muslim, normally had a large harem, very little time for their kids. They were almost always at war, etc. So in the case of Mughal history, you do have them underlining. I mean, in the case of even the early sultanates in Delhi, you have Razia Sultana and a couple of women who've been kind of caricatured as the typical woman in power. But later on, you do have underlining of Akbar and being under the influence of his nanny, and a lot of women holding power. In the Deccan, you did mention this Golconda thing. What about indirect influence? I mean, this is a direct example of a woman negotiating, but what about indirect influence? Because most of these men grew up in a mainly female-dominated court, because the men were at war or didn't have time for them. So, what about the influence of women in the Deccan?
If your listeners and your students have time later, there's actually a lecture I did precisely on this topic about women in the Deccan across multiple centuries. It should be on YouTube. It's on the Deccan Heritage Foundation YouTube page. You can find it there. But to answer your question with a few examples, you take somebody like the Adil Shahi dynasty of Bijapur. They established by Yusuf early 1500s, and they go on till the 1680s. Now, Yusuf Adil Khan's wife was a local Maratha woman. From day one, this was a mixed dynasty where there was the Persian blood of the immigrant father and the local blood of the Hindu mother. And you find that's also another reason, I suppose, you find different Adil Shahs who were descended from this couple, sometimes choosing to celebrate the Persian side of their heritage, sometimes choosing to celebrate the Hindu or the local side of their heritage. Now, Ismail Adil Shah, who's a second Adil Shah, is deeply influenced by the Persian side, but that's because he was raised by a Persian aunt, and she was a staunch Shia, which ended up having an impact on his policy. The mother, who was this Hindu woman, in the next generation, she finds the grandson who's come to power isn't really up to the mark. She orchestrates a coup. She helps a certain number of noblemen orchestrate a coup, gets rid of him, and puts on the throne another grandson who very likely was illegitimate. So you have a woman, a grandmother being very unsentimental, but for dynastic interests, for the interests of her family and the kingdom, she prefers one grandson over the other. It's not very mollycoddly. It's not just the grandmothers we have in our mind. This is politics, and these women saw themselves as political actors. You find somebody, go to the Sultanate of Ahmednagar, Chand Bibi, as I mentioned earlier, she was a princess who had first been married into the Bijapur royal family. There she played a political role. She was ousted in a coup. She was imprisoned for a while. And then eventually she comes back to her maternal home in Ahmednagar. When the Mughals invade, she again plays kingmaker, and she physically leads people during the siege of Ahmednagar. And when the fortress is breached, she actually goes in and helps, sort of leads the men as they fill up the breach. So she's again very visibly over there. Her mother, a lady called Kunza Humayun, was regent for her son for many years after her husband died. And in fact, some of the sort of narratives that exist, obviously they're exaggerated. There is a degree of sexism as well. They say that she was a bit hesitant to give up power. So ultimately the nobles had to round up her, supporters for her son and get this woman out of the picture. And it's quite interesting because there's a manuscript from this time, which initially showed Kunza Humayun and her husband together in several pictures. But somebody later decided that this was not acceptable, and she was actually physically painted out of these pictures. She was reduced to a giant smudge in some of these pictures. In my paperback edition of my book, I've got one of those pictures where you see the Nizam Shah, and then you look next to the Nizam Shah and you see this semicircular smudge, and that used to be Kunza Humayun. But that, in a sense, also gives you a glimpse into the kind of influence she had. She was somebody who clearly upset enough people that she had to be wiped out even from paintings. You go way back to when the first Islamic armies invaded the Deccan, and you find that on the way to Devagiri in the 1290s, around 1296, Alauddin Khilji leads the army into Devagiri. One of the places on the way where they met resistance was this local chieftain supported by two women. And there's a contemporary chronicle that talks about how they fought like tigresses and so on, which shows that they were active in the army at that particular time. They were unusual, obviously, because you don't hear that much about women fighting in the front lines, but clearly these two women did. Come all the way to the 18th century. Let's go to the 17th century. Shivaji, who leads the Marathas. Read any book on him, read any traditional biography of him. You find that the greater influence on him was his mother rather than his father. There were times he didn't see his father for as many as 12 years because his father was engaged in a different part of the Deccan, and he and his mother were left in Pune. And it was his mother's influence that in a great way worked on his mind. And traditional accounts say that even his idea of resurrecting Hindu pride and a Hindu kingdom came partly because his mother was descended from the Yadavas of Devagiri, and she kept alive that kind of dynastic memory and then transmitted it to her son. There may be exaggeration, but again, the important thing is that the mother's influence was critical to shaping up the son's career. In the 18th century, take somebody like Tarabai. She was Shivaji's daughter-in-law. Once the Mughals have invaded, there's absolute chaos. This woman's at the helm for so many years. She ultimately is imprisoned and removed from the scene by force. And then 30 years later, when she gets an opportunity, again, she seizes the opportunity and she again comes on board trying to play kingmaker. So the women, in a way, are absent if you look just at the surface of the story. But if you read between the lines, if you alert yourself to identify those important places and those important positions taken by the women and the influence they might have had, you start finding that they actually start emerging from the archives, and they emerge from the material a little better. There's another thing to be remembered. There's a scholar called Arik Moran who's done work on the Rajput hill states, nothing to do with the Deccan, but he makes an important point about how he gives the example of a queen, a Rajput queen in the early 19th century, who was very influential. She actually governed. She was extremely powerful, but Rajput social mores did not allow women to have that kind of influence. So when she was written about, her place was always diminished. It was always made to see that her son was actually in charge, even though he was a minor, because it was not acceptable for a Rajput woman to cross that boundary and play that kind of a role. So the material we read sometimes doesn't reveal the entire truth. You have to connect that with a bunch of things and then figure it out. Even in the 1630s, I'm thinking again of this Begum in Bijapur called Khadija, who comes off from the Qutub Shahi court. She's a Qutub Shahi princess from Golconda, married to the Adil Shah of Bijapur. And she comes here, and of course, her brother's financing her. He's sort of whispering in her ears and giving her ideas. to sort of upset the internal arrangement of the Adil Shahi court into which she's married. So there's a Hindu general and there's an African nobleman. And this lady plays on her husband, encouraged by her brother. And essentially because she's still in a way loyal, I suppose, to her own family home, to her own kingdom. And, she ends up toppling both this African nobleman and the Brahmin minister, the Brahmin general, who's very violently killed and ends up having a clique that is so loyal to her and that's loyal to her interests installed in power. So the women were always there. It's just that they were not necessarily always written about. They were not necessarily always acknowledged. Subsequent generations sometimes wanted to wipe them out even from paintings. But if you learn to sort of look beyond that, they start appearing more and more, and you can't ignore them and the political roles that they played.
Excellent. I have a question on the A word, which has now become a very controversial word to say. It's Aurangzeb. So you title your book from Rebel Sultans from Aladdin Khilji to Shivaji. When after reading it, all I felt was the two most important men was the guy who broke into the Deccan, which is Khilji through Malik Kafur, Devgiri, etc., and then Aurangzeb, who finally unifies, who destroys this British claim that they unified India, because historically the first person to unify North and South India, what you'd call the larger or India Mania today, was Aurangzeb. So why didn't you title your book from Khilji to Aurangzeb? And is there a specific reason? And would you say something about Aurangzeb before we go back to the Mughals?
That's a good point, actually. That would have been a very clever way of titling it. But I thought, the book ends with Shivaji and it ends with the rise of the Marathas. There's a lot of literature on the Marathas, and partly because I grew up here, I knew that literature already existed. There's, good literature, there's bad literature, there's, all of that exists, but there's enough attention paid to that subject, paid to that period, and specifically to the first Chhatrapati. And I thought, he's clearly representing something new. Aurangzeb comes and breaks what exists in the Deccan. He demolishes the sultanates that are there, but ultimately his dominance is not entrenched. In a sense, he overstretches and he's unable to maintain the whole. The man gets mired in the Deccan for the last 25 years of his life, precisely because the Marathas are fighting him. What happens is that the Deccan sultanates are already on a weak wicket at the time the Mughal invasions really pick up under Aurangzeb. As I mentioned earlier, their own internal crises, their own internal cleavages that existed are already, in a sense, getting difficult to balance. There is already internal chaos building up. And Aurangzeb, in a sense, plays to that. He takes advantage of it and he wipes these sultanates out. But the ultimate victory is not gained by Aurangzeb. It's gained by Shivaji. He's the one who ends up creating a new kingdom, a new ideology of power, consciously deciding that now we will have Hinduized institutions, we will no longer use Persian. Not all of it succeeded, because you find that soon after Shivaji's death, again, a lot of Persian practices come back in. His own grandson Shahu, who succeeds, who spent a lot of his early years as a prisoner in Aurangzeb's camp, is quite influenced by that kind of Mughal culture. So that doesn't succeed, but Shivaji is clearly trying to establish something new. And the Marathas from there, even though they face challenges, even though Aurangzeb gives them a very tough time, through the 18th century, their power grows and they actually end up fanning out of the Deccan. And they go all the way to Tanjore, in Tamil Nadu, in one corner of South India. They're fighting in Afghanistan by the end of the 18th century, or on the borders of Afghanistan. They've gone all the way to Bengal, all the way to Orissa. The Jagannath temple is controlled by them. In a sense, they become the dominant hegemonic power in India after that. So my play really was Alauddin Khilji comes and puts an end to the medieval area. Then there's the period that I cover, which is the next 400, 500 years. And then there's the dawn of the Marathas, who go out and fan across India and dominate a huge portion of India till they're finally toppled by the British in 1818. So I thought I was just playing on that. But you're right, I could have titled it From Khilji to Aurangzeb, but it would not have given it a completeness, I think, because ultimately where the story ends is not with Aurangzeb, but well after Aurangzeb's death, with the Marathas becoming the next big thing, not just in the Deccan, but in India as a whole.
Going back to the Marathas, a very favorite topic. I grew up in Bombay as well, so a lot of... Now, before we talk about the Marathas, a question keeps repeating in a lot of my discussions about Indian history, and that's the fact that there is this play on leaving aside the Hindu-Muslim play, and we'll come back to it in a second, there's a play in between foreigners and locals. And this is a play that's very clear from epigraphs, even 10th century, 11th century. The first book that was actually, which is written by Jnaneshwar in Maharashtra Prakrit, is very clear. Amrit Anubhava is very clear about the foreign Turks coming to destroy our religion, kind of a thing. According to you, how much of weight would you put at this foreign rule, and how far would you pull this in? Because obviously, up till the 13th century, the sultanates were all foreign until a lot of the sultans were indigenous. But they kept replenishing their blood, replenishing race. They were also very racially conscious, some of them at least. So how would you put this foreigner versus local narrative over the politics of the years that you covered from Khilji to Shivaji?
It's actually very complicated because it doesn't exist in all planes and at all layers and levels in the same way. Now, the work you are referring to, for example, in a sense, it's an elite, response to it. Even take a text like the Madhura Vijaya. Texts in Sanskrit, even, a lot of them are elite preoccupations. They're about powerful segments of society who have something to lose, who have something at stake in the existing order, under the existing Hindu rulers who are there, who are obviously patronizing Brahmins, but also, as Anirudh's book shows, more than we acknowledge, they were also patronizing Jains and Buddhists, especially in Karnataka and so on. But even so, these were people who had a stake in the existing system. So when you have a disruption like this happening, they stand to lose the most. What's interesting is that the disruption creates new opportunities for other people to become stakeholders in the new system. The emergence of the Rajputs in North India, the emergence of the Marathas in the Deccan, it happens because of the disruption. Vijayanagara emerges because of the disruption. There were the earlier, my one argument that I have against people who claim that Vijayanagara was purely about defending the Hindu faith and so on and protecting Hindu culture, is that they made no effort to resurrect the older dynasties. There must have been descendants around of the Hoysalas, the Kakatiyas, all the medieval dynasties that had so much history, that had so much legitimacy. But although they claimed some connections to them through marriage, or this one married a granddaughter of the Hoysala emperor and so on, they never made an effort to resurrect that earlier order. They also took advantage of the disruption to create something new. And that comes across in their 1347, the first time the title appears, Hindu Raya Suratrana, Sultan among Hindu kings, which is that the idea of the sultanates, what that represents, something new, a new order, a new system, they want to claim it as well. And they say that, okay, you are sultans among the Turks or the Turukas, we are the Hindu sultans. They appropriate the word sultan as well. So I think there is obviously one segment of people who've lost out and who are aware of that sense of loss. And that's often expressed in a religious vocabulary. Our way of life is gone. Our temples do not have pujas happening anymore. Everything that is familiar to us is being destroyed. In the Madhura Vijaya, very graphic terms about the blood of Brahmins flowing in the rivers and the blood of cows in the temples and so on and so forth, Brahmins being hanged, and that kind of very graphic language. And that represents the final cry, I suppose, of one set of people who've been displaced from a position of influence. But what's important is that the next system that emerges creates new opportunities for new communities who become the new elites. The other thing also is that the idea of the foreigner and the local, it's played out in India constantly all the way till the 19th century. In fact, it's happening even now. I don't know if your students are aware, but the whole Northeast debate about the NRC and the CA and the National Registry of Citizens and so on, it's about Bengali immigrants in Assam. It's about immigrants from Muslim Bengali speakers from Bangladesh who moved to the Northeast of India. Migration is always problematic. It creates certain kinds of resentments. In my latest book, False Allies, I talk about how you go to different princely states in what is the Deccan and in South India, and you find that the tag foreigner is applied not just to the British, but also to Indian subordinates of the British. So there was a huge community of Maharashtrian Deshastha Brahmins who supported the East India Company and were the administrative backbone. They were the Indian sort of clerical class underneath the East India Company. They ended up going into these states and dominating the higher end positions there as ministers and bureaucrats. And resentment grew, welled up among the local people who said that these are foreigners. They're actually Brahmins, they're actually Hindus. but they're not from there. Therefore, they're considered foreigners. So this foreigner, insider, outsider kind of debate, you see it in the Deccan Sultanates existing with the Persian immigrants, the local Muslims. But again, remember the local Muslims, or the Westerners versus the indigenous people. The so-called local faction included the Africans. The Africans were also immigrants, but they were not part of the Persian cultural kind of setup. They came and they pinned their hopes with the local Marathas and the local Sunni Muslims, and therefore they were accepted as locals, whereas the Persians, who came not just as immigrants, but immigrants with power, immigrants with cultural baggage, immigrants with a kind of prestige, which was threatening to the locals, they were the ones seen as outsiders. So it's a fascinating debate. I think it builds into a larger conversation of how migration has shaped Indian history, how moving around and communities moving around plays such a big role. How did Rajputs end up in Kerala? How did Afghan groups end up serving the Maratha kings of Tanjore? How did Telugu become the court language of a Tamil state ruled by Maratha kings whose own mother tongue was Marathi? It's such a fascinating debate, but it's not constricted just to the Deccan or just to the period I cover. It's actually much bigger. I think there's a fascinating book idea in there to begin with, just migration and Indian history.
I'm actually playing around with a lot of the questions on a book idea I'm working on based on my research of the 1300s.
Oh, excellent.
A lot of these questions just come from there because, I found your book very, very, how would you call it, complementary to what I've been reading, studying, and theses that I've been propounding. So that's why a lot of that comes from there. We have a question from somebody in the group, but before I pass on to that, just like your thoughts on, we actually had day before yesterday, I wanted to tell you this, a talk on one of our students who's doing a PhD on the origins and the resurgence of Deccani, and specifically the arrival of Deccani as the Helvi with Khilji, but the redominance of a new language which is very influenced by Marathi, by Telugu, Kannada, and Urdu. So kind of goes, on the linguistic track of what we're doing. To me, while the Portuguese came to stay, the English came to trade and became kind of de facto, kind of ruling became an obligation that they needed to do if they wanted to trade. So they became reluctant rulers of India, and not many people
in the early phase.
In the East India Company, earlier part of the East India Company.
I mean, by the time I think you come to Lord Wellesley, it's very clear he definitely is an imperialist. So much so that his own bosses want to sack him by the end because they're sending him clear orders from London saying, don't conquer, and this man's just going left, right, and center, conquering what he sees.
And this is a very interesting observation you make in your new book, because I think that's where I picked up. That's probably the first time I picked something up which said 2/3 of India was still ruled by kings in 1947, and 1/3 of India was ruled by presidencies. Now, the next question...
No, it's the other way around. 40% was with the princes, 60% was with the British.
But this was after the doctrine of lapse. This was after
after all the annexations.
After all the annexations. Two questions. One is the follow-up question will be Madhav Syamakrishnan has asked a follow-up question, but I'll ask you my question first because it'll be more organic. Do you feel that the East India Company and the English fudged history because to suit their own purposes, and is that a burden we bear, specifically when it comes to maps? And this is a question I put to Anirudh as well, so I'd love to hear what you say.
Certainly, because if you ask Indians to shut their eyes and just picture India, the image that comes to your mind is the Indian map, and often romanticized versions of it where you have the Kashmir as the head, and then the feet, and it's often cast as a woman, right? We always call it a motherland. It's also highly sort of gendered in that sense. The motherland, the mother, woman's honor. So every time Pakistan comes up in public debates, it's our honor. The motherland has been attacked and so on. And that map has obviously got politics of its own. You do read about how even the act of mapping, even the act of surveying was hugely resisted by Indian people. You hear stories about how these survey groups would go out with their survey flags and so on, and villagers would not cooperate because they didn't want these people to know where their forts were, where their water bodies were, where the hills were, what was across the hills, what was under the soil. They didn't want people to know this. So it was something that the British really had to get done over a long stretch of time. And it was very tough. In fact, for my thesis, I'm just looking at stuff from Travancore. And one of the first things after an 1809 rebellion that the East India Company puts down is to immediately start building roads, is to immediately start developing canals and communications, and to start surveying the place. They have two officers go into different parts of the state to report on the natural conditions, the topography, and so on. And they come back saying, actually, there's only one major highway. This country is extremely difficult to penetrate in the interiors, which means that if you really want to hold it, it has to be opened up. And there's that kind of investment in opening it up, in mapping it in a modern way, etc., that comes up. So I think that the English certainly had not just a very physical impact on India, but also a psychological impact. What we think of as India. There are parts of the Northeast, for example, which are in India purely by administrative accident, not because anybody sat there and thought, oh, these people are committed to India and so on. Why is it that the longest standing insurgency in India is in the Northeast? People are obsessed with Kashmir and Pakistan, but they don't realize is that the Nagas in the Northeast have always resisted. They resisted the British state, and once the British state was replaced by the Indian state, they resisted the Indian state. A lot of those maps, a lot of those boundaries have not been accepted. A lot of that has not been. Some of it is a matter of international dispute with China, for example. The burden of history point that you make, it's interesting, but it also opens up to me. The question is, do you look at it just from the lens of colonialism in India, or do you look at it from a larger lens? What you do find is that in India, we didn't look at history in the way the West did, where you sit down, you have clear dates and chronologies and all of that. If you look at traditional accounts, I'm from Kerala. So if you look at the Keralolpatti, for example, it's full of chronological inaccuracies. Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara in the Deccan is placed way back in somewhere in the 12th century or something, whereas this poor man lived in the 16th century. So there's that kind of chronological infirmities in the text. But even so, the text represents how people, or the authors of that text, that segment of society wanted the past to be remembered. And in India, you have a lot of this. You have different communities remembering the same thing in different ways. You have historical figures remembered by different groups of people. Some as heroes, some remember the same person as a hero, some remember the same person as a villain. So that this act of remembering is naturally a political act. It's about people picking and choosing what they want to remember, how they want to remember it, and how that act of remembering gives them meaning. It gives them their narrative, gives them their sense of who they are. Different communities, different groups, different regions. There's just why, someone as controversial as Emperor Aurangzeb, who comes and conquers the Deccan, fights the Sikhs and so on. Audrey Trushka makes that point, right? That to a lot of the people at the receiving end, he's this tyrant who comes in and terrorizes everybody. But for him himself, he was an emperor. These were small issues in different parts of the empire. None of them was big enough for him to see as some kind of major issue. Perhaps the Marathas towards the end, but a lot of it was just smaller issues he was putting down as an emperor. It's a provocative line, but it does give you something to think about. That, different things are remembered by different people in different ways. And some of that, I think, must inform the way we look at how the East India Company also dealt with history, which is that they were in India as a foreign power. They needed to make sense of this place. So they came up with their own version of history. They came up with their own version of, in quotes, authentic Indian history, which served their purposes. So long as we understand that their history served their purposes and therefore we need to look at it critically, we should be able to negotiate that okay. But the fact is that, yes, I think, it was spoon-fed to Indians for so many generations that a lot of it was internalized, a lot of it was sort of swallowed whole, and it's taken us a long time to break that. That kind of, getting out of that mental mold, getting out of that conceptual mold is a long drawn process. I don't think we fully triumphed, but I think we're aware of it now. Our eyes have been opened, and therefore there's a lot of people trying to look at the same subjects without the colonial filter that was applied to us psychologically and over long stretches of time.
No, because one of the reasons why I asked this question is because what the research I'm doing falls into a lot of gaps in between the same interpretation of the Portuguese and the English of the same history, because I do a lot of Goa-based. My family is originally from Goa, so a lot of Goa-based research. So, and that's kind of put me to a situation where you had Robert Sebel saying something and you had a Portuguese historian saying something. So we're not talking about two Indians here or one Indian. We're talking about two contemporary European historians who had a completely different interpretation of the same geographical area. Because as you remember, Bombay started off being a Portuguese holding given in dowry to the English. So that whole chunk of the west coast that goes from Gujarat right down to a certain extent Kerala, but more a little more up north because Kerala was far, far earlier in the colonization. Kind of contested between the Portuguese and the English, but you had influence of both. You had them debating about the authenticity of copper plates and copying copper plates, destroying them, shipping them off to Portugal so that the British didn't see them. So there was a lot of this rivalry that's been actually chronicled over time, at least some of it. So that's where my question came from. Let me ask you Madhav's question, which says, there used to be a great blend of Hindu and Muslim cultures in the Deccan Sultanates. How did Christianity impact the Deccan kingdoms, and how was that religion seen by the sultans?
You only have a few glimpses, like an Ibrahim Adil Shah II certainly had, people from the Portuguese enclave in Goa coming to see him. You find even the last Qutub Shah of Golconda in his time as well. I think one of his sons-in-law was very happy with, again, one of these, perhaps a Jesuit who was passing through and basically sat there and pumped this man for information and knowledge. And they had some kind of similar intellectual interests that existed. More of the sort of direct engagement happens in the coastal enclaves. It happens in Kerala, for example, where you find that there are these great debates that are hosted by the Zamorin of Calicut, where the Jesuit fathers will come and they will talk about why Hinduism and the Hindu gods are all false and why Christianity is the true thing. And then the Hindus will respond to it, and they have their take on this. And it's fascinating. If you read that material from the 17th century, it's the most interesting, colorful, sort of dynamic kind of exchange that happens. There isn't that kind of rich material I've come across, at least as far as the Deccan Sultanates are concerned. But you do see that the occasional Jesuit does appear. They do pass through. There are occasional references that exist. More importantly, there is a European influence because the Portuguese were trading with these sultans. Sometimes they were trading, sometimes they were fighting. Sometimes people from there, perhaps escaping crimes, perhaps escaping persecution by the Portuguese, would end up coming to the sultans and becoming doctors, advisors in certain respects. Somebody like Haida comes in and becomes a painter. He's a Dutch painter, but he's also spying for the Portuguese. So it's an interesting thing that he's doing. Or is he spying for somebody else? But I think it's for the Portuguese only. But there's also espionage happening over there. But these are, as far as I've seen, only a few glimpses. There isn't that much exhaustive material that I've come across. On Haida, for example, there is, and it's been covered in a book. I don't know if it's by Roy Fischel or somebody else, but there is a book that talks about it. But beyond that, I don't think I've seen much more about it. But there were the occasional influences coming in, and there were people who were certainly aware of it. Some of it comes across in the art, where you do find that European art has an impact on Deccan art. You find a lot of Europeans appearing in these Deccan paintings, dressed, or at least people dressed as Europeans who have the right complexion. So we have every reason to assume that these are Europeans featured in those Deccan paintings. And from there, it's the same with the Mughals also. You have that European influence coming up in late Akbar's final sort of decades and in Jahangir's time in Mughal art as well. So yeah, there's that kind of influence from the West. I don't know how much Christianity as a religion had an influence at this time. In the 17th century, you find Jesuits going all the way into the interiors, not just the coast, to Chandragiri, where Emperor Venkata was in power. And he, of course, had his incentives. He wanted the Jesuits to sort of, he wanted to use them as mediators with foreign powers for his own terms. But then when there was a falling out with them, he expels the Jesuits from his court. So there's, it's a mixed bag. The Christian missionaries who came to these courts were not purely religious functionaries. They sometimes served as diplomats, sometimes as spies, sometimes as people just collecting information on local philosophy, on local culture, and writing about it.
If there are any other questions, please ask. Otherwise, I will ask my last question. I think we're up with an hour, and time has actually passed quite quickly. So please ask any questions. You can type them out, put your hand up, or put your mic on. Okay, so there is a nice long question. It's a wonderful time listening to you, Mr. Pillai. I have a few questions, if you could answer them. You talked about chronological inaccuracies in the sources where Krishnadeva was pushed back to the 11th, 12th century. Did this have a political or social significance?
It does. I mean, in the sense of how we look at the past, right? I'll give you an example. I got into some trouble with a BJP politician, a right-wing politician, who, after I gave an interview in which I was describing this oral legend that's been passed down in Kerala about how there was a sage called Vararuchi, and he had a local wife, a Parayar caste wife, so he's a Brahmin. This is a woman of the lowest kind of community that existed at that time. And they ended up getting together, and they have a number of children. And each of the children is assigned to a different caste. So one son becomes a Brahmin, another is a carpenter, another is a Muslim. One is even a deity in a temple. So it's an eclectic collection. There's only one girl. Most of them are sons. And there's all kinds of fascinating stories about this. The Brahmin invites all his brothers for a feast. And Brahmins don't eat beef. But one of the brothers actually brings the udders of a cow to be served at the feast. So it's interesting the kind of dynamics that exist. But I got into trouble because I did mention that one of the sons is supposed to be a Muslim. And this politician did his own, in quotes, research where he said, oh, but Vararuchi lived in the 5th century or something. Islam was born only a couple of centuries later. So there's no way Vararuchi could have a Muslim son. Now, that's the wrong way of looking at this material. You're not looking at it for chronological accuracy. This is an oral legend that's been passed down. And the historian's job is to ask that why does the legend exist in this shape? Why is it claiming there are Muslims in the story? And why is it trying to get all these castes placed in the story? And the answer perhaps is that the legend is creating a space for all these communities to be recognized as ultimately members of the same broader cultural space. If you go looking for chronological accuracies in it, you're going to find lots of issues with a lot of Indian legends. The real way of looking at it is to understand that these are not written down, footnoted, clinical, historical sources as we tend to work on in the modern period. This is, as I said, a way of remembering. This is a way of creating cultural bridges, and they need to be approached in that way. It can get political because if you talk about it clearly, people can attack you and say that you're chronological inaccuracies, you're a bad historian. But as I said, there's a way to look at the same material and discover these fragments of truth, fragments of actual historically important evidence within this sort of broader frame of legend and seemingly improbable things, such as a Brahmin man giving birth to a deity, for example.
Chirantan, the person who asked this question, also asks, how did matrimonial alliances shape the politics of that period?
Oh, very much, because who you married was very rarely a personal choice. It often had political connotations. So when Yusuf Adil Khan, the first Adil Shah of Bijapur, marries the sister of Mukund Rao Maratha, it's something of an alliance as well. It's the same reason why Akbar marries a Rajput princess, because it's a political alliance. The marriage isn't a personal affair. In fact, there's a biography by Parvati Sharma that's recently come out where she talks about how a lot of the Mughal emperors, even in their own writings, spoke about their romances, including Babur talking about his obsession for a boy, Jahangir and Noor Jahan. There's love stories there. And that these were genuine romances. But that doesn't exist for Akbar. These were alliances that he signed with these political people. And that exists in the Deccan as well. When Malik Amber gets his African daughter married to the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar, a Nizam Shah who himself is a mix of Brahmin blood and Persian blood, it's a political alliance because Malik Amber is a kingmaker. The Nizam Shah is under his thumb. He needs the Nizam Shah for legitimacy, but to cement his hold over the king, he also needs his daughter married to the king. Of course, the king doesn't like that particular daughter. He's got a Persian wife who conspires against the daughter. So the daughter and the father end up killing the king. But that's another part of this story. So it wasn't purely about marriage. It was about cementing the right kind of alliances, which is not to say kings did not fall in love. Obviously, that may also have happened. The famous story of one of the Qutub Shahs falling in love with a Hindu woman and founding a city in her honor. It's just a legend, but it again gives you a glimpse that perhaps great romances did exist, but marriage versus romance, there was a difference. People did not marry for love necessarily. They married for much more pragmatic reasons. Even how an emperor or a ruler's time was divided. If you, for example, paid too much attention to a wife from, say, X family, and you did not pay enough attention to a wife from Y family, the faction that Y family controlled might just end up getting upset because the woman who represented their alliance with you was being ill-treated or was being neglected. So there's all kinds of political connotations to this.
There is a final question, and after that I'll ask mine, and then we'll call it an evening because we're really above time. You've talked about the political contextualizations of the destruction of several temples in your book. Is there a mainstreamed way? Hang on. Is there a way that can be mainstreamed and used to debunk insane ideas that the right wing is so desperate to propagate?
Can you come back to the first part of it? Was it about temple destruction?
Yeah, you've talked about the political contextualization of the destruction of several temples in your book. Is there a way that it can be mainstreamed and used to debunk the insane ideas that the right wing is so desperate to propagate?
I think if more people talk about it and again don't see it, if you're going to be emotionally hurt by it, perhaps this is not the topic for you. I mean, I'm talking generally, because the fact is that, sacred sites in India have been repurposed well before the Muslims came into the picture. You have tribal shrines that turn into mainstream Hindu temples of so-called the higher pantheon. You have a temple like Madurai Meenakshi, who's clearly a local goddess, an androgynous goddess, who then in a later period becomes an avatar of Parvati. You have Buddhist shrines in Kerala that have become temples. The Nagarkoil temple in Tamil Nadu in Kanyakumari district was a Jain institution till as recently as the 16th century, I think, because we have grants to the Jains from the Wayanad kings in that period. So that kind of repurposing happened. Karnataka, you read Veerashaiva literature, and my God, it's extremely violent about what they go and do to Jain places of worship. And there's talk about the impalement of Jains and tremendous violence being unleashed by Shaivite saints against the Jains. So conflict over religious spaces and the conversion of religious spaces was not something that started with Islam. We sometimes fall into this trap of, oh, this person demolished that temple, therefore, that's this big wound that's there. If you look at the large span of history, that's actually not an aberration. There is a difference, of course. Let's say a Hindu king, sort of going into an enemy king's territory and stealing gods and putting down a temple. Krishnadevaraya does it in Orissa. He brings back one deity from Orissa, and he even brings back one deity from Maharashtra. The Maharashtrian deity is eventually returned. There, of course, you can argue that even though he's destroying those temples, he's not destroying the deity. He's taking the deity and sort of bringing the deity to his own kingdom, and therefore still preserving the overall sort of Hindu identity. Whereas the Muslims came and they would demolish everything. The deity was also broken into pieces. So you can perhaps quibble over those differences, and perhaps that was a major civilizational cleavage, as some people would like to pose it. But if I were to look at the long arc of history and the broader exchange, even before the Muslims came into the picture, violence over religion was not new. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we explore it seriously, people will also stop getting agitated and aggravated emotionally about these things.
I mean, for example, just a more modern example was the Marathas sacking the Udpi Mata and Tipu Sultan giving restitution to the Mathadisha.
Even in the early 19th century, there's a story of Holkar, right, in Rajasthan. The Marathas were hated by the Rajputs, because they came in, and Nath Dwara, which is one of the most auspicious and sacred sites in Rajputana, was sacked by Holkar. So what do you say about that? 200 years ago.
Around. So, my final question, and then we end for today. I have a lot of. I am trying to do a lot of study on Jewish trade with the Western Coast and Jewish influence on the Western Coast, pre-colonial, pre-European colonialism. Kerala is obviously a state which has a very strong Jewish presence. Have you come across any literature, anything over your research, especially in this period, from Khilji right up to Aurangzeb, which talks about Jewish influence, especially on the West Coast and the Deccan, etc.?
Not very much. There are some references basically to Jews being persecuted, during the Inquisition, and once the Inquisition came to Goa, suspected Jews, people who had converted, and they were believed to have lapsed back into Judaism secretly, and so on. So there are a few references to that. But outside of the Deccan really is where sometimes they show up in more interesting places. In my research on Kerala, for example, I came across a document about how, they had this practice of legal trials by ordeal, which is that, if there's a dispute and there's, whatever the charge may be, the person who's accused of the charge has to dip his hand into boiling oil or boiling ghee. And if the hand comes out and it's not completely damaged after a certain duration, then you're innocent. The gods have decided that you're innocent. And I came across this fascinating record of a Jew performing that, because he had a dispute with a local Hindu, and this was just the way it was, such disputes were settled, and this Jewish man had to do it. And he later, of course, the British resident went and spoke to him, and he complained and said, yeah, I didn't want to do it, etc. But one suspects it was more the British being horrified that this was happening, whereas a Jewish gentleman was just like, well, this is how disputes are resolved here. If everybody's dipping their hand in oil, let me also dip my hand in oil. So so a few interesting glimpses do occasionally come up, but I haven't really looked for anything related to the Jewish aspect in this period. So I don't think I can be of much use there.
Anyways, time has flown, and we had a great time. I hope you had a great time as well, Manu.
Thank you
for making the time. I know it's a really busy time for you with your theses. So all the best with your PhD thesis, and I'm sure we'd love to read it once you're done with it. So
Thank you.
like all your other books, all the best. Do stay in touch, and again, thank you very much for making the time today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody who attended.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for attending, and have a